In the process of historical development, these categories are subjected to further interference from a variety of forces that refuse to recognise the validity of local borders and their containment of discrete and different cultures. The result is a version of nation in which the fixity of proper regional borders is increasingly difficult to enforce. Nations are welded together from arbitrary parts and are therefore in themselves unstable and subject to constant change. Such incomplete structuring, a process of shapeless becoming, typifies the grotesque category. Accordingly, the use of the grotesque serves to undermine the dominant and its monological desire to unify, naturalise and totalise. In the shifting complexity of the grotesque body, we can read different versions of region and nation. Bodies, like countries, are sites of struggle, conflict and accommodation. Moreover, to discern a variety of regions within the construction of nation is both to fracture and to reconstruct the relation between part and between part and whole. In the same way, the grotesque body is a scrambled version of an ideal arrangement of parts. Yet many grotesques, such as griffins, harpies, the Sphinx, and so on, have achieved a degree of representational stability and even a nobility of form. In a similar way, regions as parts of nations, or nations as parts of empires, forge new shapes that appear at odds with nature or with natural boundaries. The use of the grotesque category serves then to uncover or to recover a sense of the constructedness of the world we inhabit. We return again to Gray's multiple preoccupation with the nature of making. It is important to be clear at the outset what is meant by the grotesque. From the point of view of literary history, I note that different kinds of grotesque have operated at different times. Cultural critics have reinforced a sense of these differences. The medieval and Renaissance grotesque, for instance, was typified in Mikhail Bakhtin's book on Rabelais in 1965 translation, which sees the grotesque as a branch of carnivalesque celebration. This serves at specified times of the year both to uncrown and renew the central authority of the state. For other critics, such as Wolfgang Kaiser, the grotesque was the product of fantasy, of alienation and abnormal psychology. This might be considered as a second model of the grotesque. As it emerged in later Gothic and Romantic writing, the grotesque was more of a nightmare than a celebration. There is also a third grotesque, which is concerned with the very nature of categorization and the impossibility of stable structures in a metamorphic world. Permanence is disrupted by lusus or creative play. This, I suggest, typified the 18th century with its enthusiasm for classificatory confusions and satirical distortions. Yet it is also important in parallels to the parody and pastiche of postmodernism. The fact that Alasdair Gray's Poor Things accommodates each of the three models of the grotesque proposed above entails a rethinking of postmodernism as itself perhaps a version of the grotesque. Alasdair Gray's bizarre story is Gothic and improbable, playful, postmodern, fantastic. Its plot is unfriendly to the project of a concise summary, let alone rational explication. Much of the text is concerned with sorting out fact from fiction, rewriting and denying its own narrative, unthreading its neatly patterned plottings. The story is subtitled Episodes from the Early Life of Archibald McCandless, MD, Scottish Public Health Officer. It is edited by Alasdair Gray. In his spoof introduction, Gray announces that the doctor who wrote this account of his early experiences died in 1911, and readers who know nothing about the daringly experimental history of Scottish medicine will perhaps mistake it for a grotesque fiction. His whole creative effort appears to have been to defamiliarise the ordinary by insisting on its strangely grotesque lineage, noting, for instance, that the book was bound in black cloth with a grotesque ornament stamped on the batters, and by including grotesque designs by Strang. Later, Gray notes, I have collected enough material evidence to prove the McCandless story a complete tissue of facts. Part of the grotesque game is to blur the distinctions between fact and fiction. In a sense, this is what has happened to Scottish history, inflated by myth, distorted by alien readings, and usually marginal. Is there any possibility of recovering local histories? Appropriately, the text opens with a bitter attack on the destruction of ordinary people's history. The text also seeks to achieve a reorientation of history on a much larger scale. The grotesque joke involves replacing London with Glasgow as the centre of empire, while at the same time providing a devastating critique of the brutally totalising forces of imperialistic ideology.